That's correct.
All right. And she's going to talk to us. Many of you heard her introduction this morning, so I'm going to let her introduce herself. And if you have any questions or needs during the session, I'm right here if I can fulfill any of those needs for you. But without further ado, Jennifer is going to help us learn this morning.
Great. Well, thank you. And it's a pleasure to be here, and I'm happy to see so many people are interested in this topic. I'll say a little bit more about myself in case you didn't hear yesterday, and this morning I was pretty quick. But I'm Jennifer Tschantz from the Office of Special Ed Programs at the U.S. Department of Education, and I work on our Early Childhood Research to Practice team, which means we get to oversee the fun, discretionary projects. So we fund work around personal preparation. We get money out to universities to train early intervention, preschool special ed, and related service folks. We also fund the technical assistance centers, which I'm going to be talking a little bit more about today. And we fund the parent programs, which I hope you are familiar with, the PTIs and CPRCs. And of course, we always like the gobbledygook of government with all of these letters, but there is meaning behind them. And if at any point in this presentation, if I say something and you have no idea what I'm talking about, please stop me, because that's one thing that I know I'm guilty of, and I hope to engage you. And I hope this will be a little bit more interactive, which I know will be hard with our virtual folks attending. So one of the things before I get started that I wanted to mention is this presentation is really, usually when I do it with our project staff. Lisa Fox at the University of South Florida is typically my partner in crime. She was not able to join me, so there's a whole part of this that is my first time ever presenting. And so the last time Lisa and I presented, I was taking copious notes because I knew I was going to be doing this on my own. So when we get to those slides, I'll let you know, because I want her to have her credit due, and also know that I want to welcome your questions, but I may not have the answers to them since she does the amazing work. So just to make sure you're all in the right session, I'm going to focus on addressing preschool suspension and expulsion through a project that we funded called the Pyramid Equity Project, or PEP, as we've been talking about it. All right, let's see if we can make this work. Uh-oh. Well, I'm fine doing it this way. Okay, so quick, I know this is hard with our virtual participants, but wanted to get, before I jump in, wanted to see if anybody was brave enough to share a little bit about who they are, why they're here, and what they hope to get out of this session. Anybody in the room willing to share a little bit? Yes?
My name is Rochelle Rigger, and I'm from Banning Unified. I work at a school known as Florida Street Discovery Center. It is the school that we house all our TK, our state preschool, our inclusion preschool class, and our special ed preschool class. I'm also in charge of PIS at that campus. I've only been at that campus for years, and one of the things that I was totally shocked at when I got there was that they just sent kids home, and I was like, they're 3, they're 4. I mean, like, how can we? So I've been really working to change that, because I don't think that first of all, teaches them anything, but second of all, they're there to learn, and if they're not there, then they're not learning. So I came here to kind of try and strengthen that for us at our school.
Great. And for those who are virtually, I just realized you probably didn't hear that, so I'll try and repeat. But Rochelle is interested. She works in an early childhood setting where on a regular basis 3-year-olds are sent home, and so she wants to gain some information about how to help begin to address that. Anybody else willing to share? Yeah?
I'm Heidi Farkas. I work in Preschool District, and I oversee independent preschool services, special ed, and there is just a lot of young preschoolers being kicked out of preschool, and everything is the same. And so I want to see the alternatives.
Great, great. For those of you virtually, that was Heidi, who shared a very similar idea that mostly gen ed, seeing a lot of the gen ed preschoolers being kicked out of programs she's worked with and wanting some alternatives.
Also the need for
Mhm.
preliminary, because it really doesn't need to be done, but, it's my view as a places that can be used for any.
So really identifying support and figuring out how and when to bring support to kids that need it. Great, great. Anyone else? Yeah, in the back of the room.
Hi, I'm John Gillies. I work for Wested. We're doing consultation in preschools here, and I'm particularly interested in this topic because I just moved here from New York, and I was part of a statewide initiative there to kind of bring the pyramid model into preschools here because this was one of the stated problems here was just that in that state was just that there was the expulsion rate among preschools was just so I'm interested in what's being done at the national level to kind of to address this. This is obviously a problem everywhere.
Great, great. And for those of you virtually, that was John, who recently moved here from New York, and the issue is alive and well in New York and in California. So, yes, Linda.
Nice to meet you. I also work for Wested, probably a different branch of Wested, and we are a partner with the National CEPL, and we do operate the teaching pyramid throughout California, just with limited funding. So I'm here because I want to support the work, and I've been very anxiously awaiting the outcomes from this PEP project.
Great, great. And again, those virtually, that was Linda from Wested, who's done a lot of work in the state around the teaching pyramid. And so I may be calling on you again to share a little bit more about the California, what things look like in California. Okay, great. Well, thank you. That really helps me focus on what I should spend more time on. Here's what I plan to talk about, and again, we can be flexible, and please feel free to interrupt. I love way more engaging presentations than just me standing up here talking. So what I hope to share was some of the really scary, awful data that really just show a piece of what the problem is that we know around suspension and expulsion, and some ideas for beginning to address some of the preschool discipline issues. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about PEP and what they're working on in terms of bringing a focus of equity with the pyramid model. And then talk a little bit more about the importance of data and data decision making for local programs. And then I'll get to share a little bit about more about the new investment we're making with the pyramid model to, again, focus on positive social competence for young children and the reduction of challenging behaviors. And as I say here, please ask questions as we go. So here's what we know. We know that when kids start getting suspended, kicked out, expelled, whatever you want to call it, which that's an issue in early care and education, what we call it, we know if it starts early, it continues as they get older in school age and later. We have data that tell us that the estimates of what's happening in early childhood settings are higher than what's happening in the K-12 world. And then we have data that are consistently showing us there are disproportionate discipline practices happening, that kids, particularly young boys of color, are being suspended or expelled at higher rates than their same age peers. So break it down a little bit. The preschool children are suspended at higher rates than school age. And these are data that come from our civil rights data collection. It's called the CRDC, the Civil Rights Data Collection, that the U.S. Department of Education does every 2 years. And I think we've had 2 rounds of data now where we've collected on this piece, and we're consistently seeing that districts, and this only represents school districts that are running preschool programs. So this is not the entire early care and education world. It's just a small slice of school districts who run preschool that are responding to this, this survey. And so we see these higher rates at preschool, and these are the rates that I think programs are thinking of more formally, suspension and expulsion, when we know what's happening in early care and education are a lot of informal, please send Johnny home, or it may not be his best day, or can he go hang out with the administrator in the front office? And those are things that are taking kids away from learning and being engaged in programs. So again, we know it's bad. We suspect that it's even worse. And then around African American children attending these public preschool programs run by local school districts, we have data that shows they are over 3.5 times more likely to receive out-of-school suspensions than their white peers. And here's a little bit more on that. So African Americans are only 19% of kiddos that are attending these public preschool programs, but comprise 47% of suspensions. Sorry, I don't mean to be depressing anyone. These are the data. And I don't think any of us are surprised that boys are suspended more than girls. I think that. But I think what really stands out is kind of the extent to which there's disproportionate discipline practices happening, particularly for African American boys. But we also see it with African American girls. So they're kicked out at higher rates than their white peers. So one of the things we wanted to do when we had this data was, what can we do about it at the federal, the national level, as John asked. And so one of the things that we started doing was we had a really strong partnership with our early care and education colleagues in HHS, the folks that run the Office of Head Start and the Office of Child Care. And we had started this idea of developing joint statements on really important topics in early care and education. And this one jumped right up to the top. And so I don't know if anybody, hopefully you've seen our joint statement on the reduction of suspension and expulsion in early care and education. Raise your hand if you've seen it, if you know about it. Great. Well, if you don't, I really, we've been hearing some really good things about both at the state and the local level, folks using this resource to kind of come up with solutions around how to take steps in the right direction. Just before I dive in and tell you what's in this one, we also did one on early childhood inclusion, which I talked a little bit about yesterday. There's one on family engagement, there's one on dual language learners, and there's also one on the connection between the McVie Home Visiting Program and IDEA Part C collaboration. And so we're really proud of these documents. I can let you know exactly how to find them on our website, but they do exist and folks are using them. And the whole reason we did these was to kind of collect information about the evidence base on whatever a topic was, and then come up with some recommendations for folks at the state level as well as the local program level. So, we all feel frustrated about this. How do we take steps forward? And so we tried to clarify and provide some guidelines about what you might be able to do. And then the other piece that I think is really important is we stacked it full of resources at the back, so free things that you can access as local providers. And so that was kind of the general purpose across all of the joint documents, but there are specific things in this one. And I have a copy here if anybody, you're more than welcome to have this one if anybody wants to take it home. Okay, so recommendations we included for states. We really felt like at the state level some action items folks could do was to really clearly communicate expulsion and suspension policies for your publicly funded, in particular, programs, but also thinking about childcare and what are your state expectations, particularly for programs that take the childcare voucher. And being really clear about those. And along those, I think, is that issue around defining, what do we mean by suspension and expulsion in early care and education. The second idea was to set goals and improvement, using data to set goals for yourself. To me, this one is so challenging because I think the data issue is really hard. We don't have a whole lot of data on this. I mean, Walter Gilliam has done some beautiful work on trying to assess the problem across different parts of the early care and education system. We have our data collection at the Office of Civil Rights does, but those are kind of the only things that are out there. And so I think this is one that states are really going to be grappling with. And then investing in workforce. Clearly, the early care and education workforce is everything. And in particular, we highlighted the need to address issues around building social competence and reducing challenging behaviors. And then establishing and implementing policies just around quality, because we know that if we have higher quality programs, a lot of the behavior problems will automatically be direct. Not all of them, but many. So considerations or recommendations for early childhood programs really kind of are very match up with the state ones. So clearly communicate and identify guidance and discipline practices for your program, and making sure that everybody is part of that piece. And then talking with families and engaging families. And I'll talk a little bit more about what PEP is doing in this space, because we think that's really important, both the community engagement and the family engagement as you talk about discipline practices. And then looking for technical assistance to beef up your workforce and to give them the support that they need to really focus on the positive aspect of building kids with strong social emotional skills that will help in the reduction of suspension and expulsion ultimately. And then using data, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about what PEP has been doing to help local programs begin to look at their data on a regular basis around discipline practices. So the other big thing we did, other than putting out the joint policy statement, is through the Preschool Development Grant Program, there was a set-aside that had national activities money. And so it's always kind of like fun, these conversations about, we have national activities money, what can we do? And knowing the huge issues in the field, this was kind of a no-brainer. Well, what could we do in this space? And we knew that the pyramid model was something that many states are already embracing and doing on a regular basis. And we decided to fund those folks to really look at the pyramid model with a lens on equity. And so over a year ago, we funded them through, in collaboration with the PBIS Center, the Positive Behavior and Intervention Support Center, to really focus on enhancing the pyramid model to include this lens on equity, and to work with 2 of our already funded preschool development sites to implement a program-wide pyramid model that really addresses this issue and strengthens this issue, and then to develop resources that could be rolled out and shared with everyone afterwards. So that's what we funded them to do. It's a 2-year investment, so they have just finished up their first year. And we're hoping this spring a lot of what I'll be talking about will begin to become available. These are the folks that we were really excited are part of the team, really being led by Lisa Fox at University of South Florida, and the folks at University of Colorado, Phil Strain, Barbara Smith and Rosemary Allen, and the folks at University of Oregon and the PBIS Center, namely Kent McIntosh there. And I'll share a little bit. I have some slides from him because he's been working on this issue in the K-12 space. All right, so here's where I begin with Lisa's slides. So if I slow down, it's because I'm new at this. So this is really, I don't know how clearly you guys can see this, but this is a real example of a teacher who has written up a behavior plan for a child, Jaden. And I'll read it to you because I know it's hard to see. So behavior targeted. For Jaden to stop inappropriate behavior that endangers himself and other children, which includes foul language, hitting, kicking classmates, and all other inappropriate actions. Goals. For Jaden to treat his teacher and classmate with respect by following program rules for safety. Appropriate guidance techniques to be applied. We will observe Jaden and sit him close to the bus driver in morning and afternoon. Time period before next conference, 2 weeks. And next steps in intervention plan will be, we will meet with mom to see if his behavior issues have improved. If not, child will be disenrolled from the program. So disenrolled, that's his side note. We see that a lot. Instead of, expelling him. He's just disenrolled. So what's the message here? He better improve or else we're kicking him out, right? And what's really missing?
They didn't put anything in place to support it.
Absolutely, yeah. There's nothing there, like you can just see where this is headed. Jaden's behavior is not going to get any better, and the teacher and the program are not going to support him. Clearly, he needs some support, and that's not happening. And, you know, Lisa and I'm sure others can share that this is not an anomaly. We see this all the time. And it's really depressing that this is happening in early care and education programs. And I think one of the things that's really important is to think about this isn't out of malice. You know, people become teachers because they love children. It's really out of not understanding that there are supports that are available that we could help these kiddos. So the Pyramid folks are working in two of our preschool development grant centers. One is in Nashville, Tennessee, and the other one is in Clifton, New Jersey. And they were chosen based on there's been a good bit of work with the pyramid model in both Tennessee and New Jersey, so they wanted to be in places where pyramid wasn't something totally new, because this wasn't about just the pyramid model, it was about taking the pyramid model and looking at it with this really specific lens on disproportionate discipline practices. Okay, so here's where, if anybody attended yesterday's session with Linda, that she walked through kind of California's version of the pyramid model. So I'm going to do big, broad strokes, but just know that California has a very well-articulated vision for what this looks like and means in California. So how many of you are familiar with the pyramid model? Okay, great. So I don't have to do a whole lot of this. This is great. So, you know, it's the tiered model. It came from, we borrowed it from the medical field, really thinking about prevention at the bottom, targeted intervention in the middle for those kids that needed a little bit more, and then individualized support for the kids who are really struggling. And I think on this slide, just remembering that it is a framework of evidence-based practices. It's not one intervention, one thing that we do that's very scripted. It's a framework to pull it all together, and there's a lot of flexibility for local programs, for different states to make it work for them. And as I mentioned before, what we were hoping to do with the PEP project was to look at all three of those tiers in the pyramid model and look at evidence-based practices with the culturally responsive lens. And that doesn't mean that we're talking about changing or having a different or new curriculum or intervention. It's just being systematic and thoughtful and bringing our awareness to the conversation about what that looks like. So the next slide, I'm going to bring up this word, the implicit bias discussion. And we actually put language specifically when we wanted to fund the PEP project around implicit bias, because we think this is really critical to this work. And it's part of what the PBIS team had already been engaging in the K-12 space. So how many of you are familiar with this term? Yeah, I mean, I think it was in the debates, I think it came up in the presidential debates, which was interesting last year. But it really is the mental process that we're not aware of that results in attitudes about people based on age, disability, race, appearance. And again, it's unconscious. We're not aware that it exists. And it supports stereotypes such as black males are dangerous. And it's one of those things that we really think is important for us in this day and age to begin to talk about. We know it's really hard to start talking about it, and I think the work that Kent McIntosh and the folks at PBIS have started are really promising. So these slides are from Kent that we're borrowing. And just a reminder that implicit bias is automatic and unconscious. It is not an indication of what we truly believe. And it's often based on stereotypes and we all have it. It exists. We're human. We all have it. And I think this last bullet is one that I think really hits home when you're thinking about interactions with young children and discipline practices. Is it's most likely to influence us when we're making snap judgments or when we're really upset about something. And so I think keep that in mind as we talk a little bit about what PEP is focused on. I think these are really, I mean, there's a whole literature base on implicit bias, which is really quite fascinating. And here's one on implicit attractiveness bias, that real estate agents rated as more attractive sell homes for significantly higher prices. And they've studied this and found that that is true. Here's another one, and this one breaks my heart a little bit because my son is on the 16th percentile. He just had his in height. But 1 inch of height is worth $789 per year in salary. And related to this, less than 15% of American men are over 6 feet tall, yet almost 60% of corporate CEOs are over 6 feet tall. Really fascinating. So what does that mean for us in early learning? How many of you are familiar with the study Walter Gilliam did around early learning and implicit bias? I see Linda's waving her hand, couple. So if you haven't, I really encourage you. He did a lot of podcasts and NPR interviews right when it came out, maybe a year ago. I'm trying to think, does that sound right? And I encourage you to search it online to listen to him talk about the findings. I'm just going to give you a little blip about it, but it's really fascinating. So what Walter and his colleagues did is they attended a national early childhood conference. And so you think about the teachers that are going to attend that conference are people who are really motivated and really care and want to improve their practice. And he asked them if they were interested to be in a study. And he pulled them together to watch a clip one at a time. They watched a clip of kids playing or sitting at a table and told them to look for behavior problems. So using this visual tracking software, he and his team were able to find out where the teachers were watching. And they tracked kind of, and I don't remember how long the segment was. But across the board, teachers of every race and background and gender tended to watch the African American boys more than anyone. And the interesting thing about this was there were no behavior problems. The kids were doing exactly what they should have been doing. They were developmentally appropriate. They were hanging out, playing, taking turns. And so it's really fascinating. So this group of teachers who are really committed to their craft bring implicit bias into the world. And so I think one of the things is that, you know, we all came into this because we're educators, because we care. And, you know, I think we have an assumption that we all believe that regardless of a child's race, gender, disability status, that they shouldn't be fated to a certain outcome, that we believe in everyone and their ability to improve and grow, right? That's kind of what we do as educators. But one of the things is that this kind of opens up a very uncomfortable topic for all of us. And I like what Kent says when he talks about this, is that it's okay if we're uncomfortable and we need to talk about it, but you cannot open up this can of worms unless you have some support for folks and some real strategies and next steps for people to take and some resources and tools. And so I think that's what PEP is doing, is beginning to design and develop some resources that if you're going down this road and you're going to talk about and have this real conversation, you should really think about utilizing the resources. And one of the things that I think, it kind of back to the point of when implicit bias tends to kick in, is when we're making those quick decisions or we're really fired up about something or upset about something. And Kent has come up with a term that they're calling vulnerable decision points, and developing neutralizing routines so that teachers And in the K-12 world, students are stepping back when they tend to jump in and make decisions about things in the heat of the moment. And so I think we're still at the very beginning of developing these tools, but I think there's a lot of promise in kind of moving forward. So what does that mean for us in early childhood? If you are familiar with the pyramid model, you know that the leadership team is everything, right? Really important. Linda's back in the room going, yes. And so for the pyramid folks, Rosemary Allen is heading up this work. Does anybody know her? Has anybody seen? So I'm going to give you, she has done a TED Talk on implicit bias in early childhood settings. Strongly recommend that you check her out. She's a phenomenal speaker. We actually had her at the OSEP Leadership Conference this summer, and she was great. Like, she got a standing ovation. People loved her.
What's her name?
Rosemary Allen. Yeah, she is wonderful, really dynamic. But she is working with Kent to develop some specific tools and resources that really focus on the equity and inappropriate discipline work, and really focusing on both the leadership team and then on the role of coaches in the pyramid model. So if you're familiar with that, you know that those two pieces are really important. And I'll talk a little bit more about what they're doing. So thinking about, and this is kind of where PEP started, was, what are the implications for the leadership team when we're thinking about things with this new lens of being culturally responsive and addressing our implicit bias. And so one thing was to really strengthen and ensure that there is a family member on that leadership team. And I would go a step further in bringing in other community members on the leadership team, making sure there are real opportunities for family input and decisions. And I would say these things have always been part of the pyramid model, but just kind of re-emphasizing, underlining it, and putting an exclamation point on how critical these are. Also for staff buy-in, that really your implementation of the pyramid model should really represent your staff and your staff's culture and background. Again, other pieces on family engagement that I won't go into all the details about all of these, but really partnering with families in a meaningful way. And ensuring that the program-wide expectations that are laid out as part of the pyramid model early on are really representative of the culture that the program has, or the culture of the staff and the children, as well as families have had some say in that piece. One other piece that I wanted to mention, because it's a really great resource, is the PBIS Center recently, it's called an ebook, put out an ebook on family engagement that's really powerful and useful, and I would encourage you to take a look at that in terms of how to engage families meaningfully in either PBIS and or the pyramid model. So clearly, professional development is a really important part of the pyramid model, and a lot of this piece of being culturally responsive and addressing implicit biases happens in the ongoing PD, professional development and coaching, and really need to be thoughtful about how you strategically embed that. And one of the things that the PEP project is working on is developing an implicit bias awareness training, which will be an online training and that will become available. I believe they're going to pilot it this spring with the 2 local programs, and so that's something to look for. And then they're also developing a coaching equity guide, which goes beyond coaching on culturally responsive practices. It really talks about building in tools that, again, looking at data, and I'll share kind of some of their data tools that they're developing around finding evidence of bias, and that once you have some data that show, we may have a classroom where there's some discipline issues going on here, and some disproportionate discipline issues going on here, how are we going to work with this teacher? And just knowing that data is just the beginning point. There's always a whole lot more behind that, and and I think they're developing a tool that will help the coaches walk through that. This is really intimate work focusing on equity. It kind of gets to who we are, and so I think one of the things that I've been really excited to see is how the Pyramid team is taking this so seriously and being thoughtful about it. And so when I've presented with Lisa, I know people are like, what, can we have that? Can we have that? And so just say, just wait. We want to be sure it's right. And, it's probably one of those things that it's going to take a while, and we may make some mistakes, but hang tight because resources are coming. And then the other piece that we think is so important is to really be thoughtful about the top of the pyramid and identifying and responding to individual children's social emotional needs. And so, this is really what Jaden needed. If you think about the beginning of it was, and we don't know anything about Jaden other than what was in there, but if there had been behavior and discipline policy up front that was really clear for the family, that would have gone a long way, and for the teacher about what behaviors happen when, and then this happens. If they had begun to partner with the family to come up with an individualized behavior plan for him, then things might have turned out a whole lot different. And unfortunately, I never found out from Lisa what really happened to Jaden, but I'm sure it wasn't what we all wanted. And then just a mention here of, so one of the PEP projects members is Phil Strain, who does the Prevent, Teach, Reinforce, which is one intervention you can use at the top of the pyramid. So if you're interested in that, I know in California you use something very similar that has really focused on an individualized behavior plan. And so if you want more information about this, I'm happy to put you in touch with Phil. He's always happy to share more about I always think about the Michael Jackson song whenever this, I don't know, the Pretty Young Thing song, whenever I see his PTRYC. Okay, sorry, my Michael Jackson moment back from the 80s. I think I'm still there. So this is the piece that I am really excited about because I'm a little bit of a data nerd, I guess is a nice way of putting it, is the use of data systems. So thinking about things from an equity perspective and looking at your data systems. For those of you familiar with Pyramid, you know that they have really developed a lot of tools around data and collecting data around fidelity, around quality indicators, around the coaching logs. They really believe in all of this information, providing more details for folks about what's working when and why, and identifying where program improvement needs to happen. And so across all of these different pieces, they are looking at it again with an equity lens and making tweaks and updates. One of the things that they're doing is looking at the benchmarks of quality companion to look at that with a culturally responsive lens. And that's another tool that's going to be out hopefully in the spring. Again, they're piloting it with the 2 programs, and so we're really excited to see that. And then the other piece is really that I'm excited about is the Tracking Behavior Incidents and Actions Report, or the BIR. Has anyone ever used the BIR that goes with Pyramid?
We use a BOR, so just to keep it a little confusing. Instead of just an incident report, we have a behavior observation report, so it's a little bit more detailed.
Great. More data. Yay. More data. Yeah, so for those participating virtually, Linda just shared that in California, you use a BOR report, a behavior observation report, that provides a little bit more data and information about what's happening when there are behavioral concerns. So one of the things that Lisa and her colleagues are developing is calculating a risk ratio with looking at, with your BIR or your BOR data, could you be able to pinpoint whether or not there are classrooms or programs that are struggling and over identifying kids and kicking kids out because of their racial, ethnic, gender background. So I won't go into too many details because it's still being tested out, but it just gives you an idea that the tool will be able to tell you and alert you when there may be a problem. And again, the data are just the beginning point. There may not be a program or a problem in what's going on in your program. But I think I'm really excited that this tool is coming on because I think it'll be a conversation starter, if nothing else. And unfortunately, I think part of the way we have the slides up here, you can't see what's behind. I had some nice slide in, which I don't do very much of because I'm too nervous that it won't work. Let me get my cheat sheet here. So anyway, the behavior incident report, and I don't know how much it varies with the BOR, it really is an opportunity to identify when there are behavioral issues, what happened, and what the response was, and how things are going to improve or support the child and the teacher if something else comes up. And it's really about identifying when and how to support the child and the teacher. The BIR actually tracks the behaviors, tries to code motivations, like what was behind the behavior, when did it happen, what activity was going on, or when during the day, and then again, the response. And then there's also another section with kind of the administrative response. Was Jaden asked to go to the office and hang out for an hour, or did he go home? So Linda, I don't know what additional, in terms of the BOR, if it's a totally different system, or is it very...
It's absolutely adapted from the BIR. We just, instead of just listing types of behaviors, we have them write we have them do an ABC chart. So they do the ABC, and then we do have the function and motivation. We have the activities, responses. So we have all of that. It's just more detailed.
More detailed, okay.
So that's when we get into our prevention replacement plan.
Yeah, for specific planning. Okay, great. Thank you for that clarification. So the one that the pyramid folks use, they developed something to be really easy for teachers to fill out. It's a one-page thing, and then the idea would be that if you wanted to track behaviors and what was happening across your program, the teachers could hand that form to someone who would enter the data into this Excel spreadsheet that the PEP project or the pyramid folks had developed, and now it's updated by the PEP project to have these equity profiles built into it. So it's supposed to be really simple. We don't want to overburden teachers with everything else they have going on. And there's I believe it's a module training around using the BIR, and I don't know, in California, you guys probably, since you've modified it, have other opportunities for learning how to fill it out. I had a feeling. But this is the interesting piece too, is that you can, as I mentioned, track the administrative action. So looking at, was a kid dismissed from school, or unenrolled, or asked to leave? Are there any sorts of in-school suspensions? And this is where a program really needs to sit down and talk about what this means in their program. And one of the things that the pyramid folks decided was that they wanted to put everything on the list, because people need to be honest about what's happening before we can really understand what the problem is and how to support folks. And so there was some discussion about, well, should we just put the options we want, which would not include suspension and expulsion. But we feel like we don't want people to feel bad about what's happening right now if we're going to figure out how to better support them. And so it has all the ugly things on the list about what could happen to a kid. So here's just a couple of slides, and this is where I really get into trouble, because these are not my slides. But just to give you some idea of what the BIR can actually pull out for you, which I think is really exciting. And programs can use this for really identifying their TA needs and their PD needs. So here's a slide that really talks about looking across a year and across time. and identifying what kinds of incidents. The blue line is the number of the behavior incidents, and then the orange line is the number of children with behavior incidents. And so you can track it and see that there's a spike in January, which, if there was a break, winter break, that's not surprising to anyone. But a program could really look at that piece across the board. And then here's one on you can, and again, this is done by, it's a pretty simple Excel spreadsheet that the data are entered into, and then it can spit out all kinds of different summary tabs for you, or summaries. So here's the percent of BIRs by problem behavior. And so the first one over here is the physical aggression. We have some running away, some social withdrawn, trouble falling asleep, unsafe behaviors, and to the right is repetitive behavior. So if this is your program, where do you think you need to have some conversation? Clearly around some of the physical aggression and how to address some of the physical aggression. And Linda, are you able to have you used with programs, the Excel spreadsheet to be able to generate any of these?
No, because this isn't just the incidents.
Uh-huh.
We really say if you're going to do a BOR, that's when you've already decided to worry.
Uh-huh.
So we have some other ways of tracking just literally, the number of incidents.
Yeah.
So the BOR is really when you're really getting ready to document and start a plan.
Got it.
So it's a little different.
Yeah, it's kind of the later step. So this is something, and it's really interesting, and I would love to hear from you all, is I know they've had this tool for a while, but there really hasn't been a lot of programs that have adopted it and used it. And so, one question is, what would it take? What would motivate you? Would it be interesting? And, to me, I love data, so anytime I can get my hands on data, I think it's really exciting. But again, knowing everything that programs have on their plate in terms of, filling out forms and identifying things, when would this tool be useful and how would it be useful for you? We'd love to hear, since you guys are in the field and living this every day. So let me show just a couple more about, you can look at things by classroom, so you could identify teachers that might be struggling. And I would say that this would be more useful if you were in a much bigger program. I mean, clearly, if you have a smaller program and you really know all your teachers, you probably know. But data is always important to be able to see that. And here's by type of activity. So looking again at arrival, center, circle time, which, I think I love, Linda, what you said yesterday about a program you've been working with where none of the kids were paying any attention during circle time. So then the question is, well, what's happening in circle time? Your circle time is probably not too exciting and engaging for kids. And so, this really does give you some information for a teacher about, when kids are really engaged and when some of those behavior problems might be appearing, and, really thinking about it in a thoughtful way. Is it the kids, or maybe it's me? And
What is this tool called again?
so the tool is called the pyramid folks use. It's called the BIR. It's the Behavior Incident Report, and it really is that one sheet that you fill out, and then you have someone who can put the data into an Excel spreadsheet that can generate these different.
So creating the data graphs is dependent on the person or the organization.
Right, yes. It's not a tool yet. I mean, we've had conversations about creating an online tool, and that might be something in the future, but it's kind of until we see that this is something that people are interested in, which I think that's an open question right now, because they're just really piloting it. So let me show you a couple more things, because kind of back to the equity thing. And then here you could analyze, what the responses of teachers have been across different behavior responses. Timeout here in this program is still being used pretty widely. Lots of verbal reminders, redirection, remove from activity, remove from area, So again, this provides a lot of data so that you have a better understanding of what's happening, both in terms of behaviors, when they're happening, and what the responses are. And then you can generate specific child summaries. So if there's a child who's really running into a lot of issues, getting more data on what's happening it can be really helpful. And I would say, in addition to the observations, clearly we never want to lose that piece, because I think you can gain so much from observing children who are struggling. But here you could get a sense of, are the behaviors increasing or decreasing over time? When are they occurring? Are there specific times we should really be supporting? And these are generally things teachers probably already know, but if you have a way to collect regular data about it, then again, it can help inform interventions and support for that particular teacher and that child. So here's kind of the new piece to this, which is developing an equity profile. So looking at the risk ratios that were earlier, if you have enough students in all of kind of your subgroups, that's the only point it'll work. If you're a really small program and you only have one kid with an IEP, you can't really do a risk ratio and identify an equity profile. It just won't work. But it will look at your kids, because as you begin to enter behavioral incidents, the first time you enter a child, and the only kids that are entered into the BIR are kids who have had a behavior incident, you enter all of their demographic information as well, so that over time and across the course of a year, you could at different points generate an equity profile to see if indeed you have any issues with kids from, African American children, Latina children, boys, girls, IEP status, all of those different pieces. Again, I want to reiterate that this is a new tool, and the way that the pyramid folks are thinking about it is that if you're using the equity profile and something comes up as, hey, we may have a problem here, it's just a flag, and it is just the beginning point of a conversation. The goal is really thinking about, again, how do you support that teacher, that classroom, and that child to be more successful. So that's the piece, and I think I'm going to stop there to see if anybody has any questions about kind of what PEP has been doing, their work, any reaction to any of the resources or ideas.
And this would be a good time, if you are virtually watching, to go ahead and load your questions into the Q&A, the live Q&A, and then we'll address them here.
I think it's great that you're tying in the equity profile, and that there's the data, the behavior incident reporting. Is there any conversations of maybe tying those as must when you're, receiving federal or state?
That's an interesting thing. There have not been any conversations about this. So I think this is so new that I think we have a lot to learn before we get to that place of must. But, I think, to me, what is exciting about the BIR is I feel like it gives an opportunity for local programs to get a better handle on if they even have an issue. I mean, number one, do you have an issue with suspending and expelling kids, regardless of who they are or where they come from, preschoolers? So that's like the big issue. And then the second issue is really looking at, are you treating different subgroups of kids differently? And is that an issue? So I think we're still at the very early stages.
The data you presented is
I know, it's just depressing, right? Depressing. But, I will say that many states, and I would also like to hear if anybody's used the joint statement from Ed and HHS, either locally or at the state level. There have been some states that have taken some steps towards legislation. I was just at a meeting where There are states that are exploring looking at suspension and expulsion around building it into their QRIS system, that you only get to be at the top rated if you have a policy in place and you're implementing that you don't suspend or expel kiddos. I know the state of Illinois recently passed some legislation around no suspension and expulsion. I think there's a lot more under that about what that looks like and what that means for the state. Yeah, Linda.
People may not know, California recently passed legislation regarding expulsion only, not suspension, and only applying to Title V funded programs. So that there will be more information coming out about that, and it's a whole interesting cart before the horse kind of thing. So just so you know. But I think it is important. In California, our equity issues are probably more complex because of the nature of changing neighborhoods and representative staffing that used to be representative, and now it's a different group in the staff. And so we're looking at this absolutely in California at the state level as well. And there's a best practice document that's going to be coming out probably in a year or so to look at some of the ways to address some of the equity issues in preschool.
Great. So for those attending virtually, that was Linda again sharing that the state of California has passed legislation on no expulsions, but just for Title V funded programs.
There's not no expulsions. It tells you what you have to do.
Oh, okay. All right, so it has some guidelines on, like, if you're going to expel, these steps need to take these things, interventions first before you can do that. And then she also mentioned a best practice guide that's coming out at some point next year that will also help. And I think, this is so complicated, and I think our gut reaction is to go to that, no, just pass a state law or pass some legislation that you can't do it. But because our early care and education systems are so complex, really thinking through, well, what does it mean if we tell them no? And, the one that kind of jumps to my mind is for child care subsidy. If you tell programs that if you accept the child care subsidy, you can't suspend or expel kiddos, what starts to happen? We start to lose kind of the supply side of who's going to be available. And so that's why we need to engage everyone in this conversation, and I think start from a place where, like, yes, we want to reduce this, but how do we build support in programs so that folks can help build the social competence of kids, which will naturally begin to address many of the behavioral concerns.
Can I ask Linda a question?
Yeah.
Linda, when those things come out, are we to find them on the CDE website?
Yes, there'll be
Under
their
special
CDE Early Education and Support Division.
Okay, so the resource coming out will be on the CDE Early Education and Support Division website. So folks should look there. Thank you. That's good. Note to self, next time Linda should be up here. If only we had known. Okay, let's see. Do you recommend sites be fully, sorry, I'm reading a question from our virtual folks. Do you recommend sites be fully trained in the pyramid model before using the BIR and equity profile? I would say yes, in an ideal world. That would be helpful. I think what I would encourage you to do is to either get in touch with Linda here in your state or the pyramid folks who will provide guidelines around how they see this being used. And it sounds like, wanting to see the BOR as well, and how that's being used in programs. Great. Do we have any other questions? No? Okay. All right. So a few other tools and resources that I wanted to be sure you knew about from the federal level. So here's the link to where you can find some suspension and expulsion resources. Our colleagues at Health and Human Services have a whole page dedicated to it. And one of the things they did maybe a year after the joint statement came out is they collected some actions that state and local folks were taking around reducing suspension and expulsion, and there's some really interesting ideas, and I think it comes across there that that local context matters, and kind of what you have in your state matters, and how you pull folks together. So I would encourage you to take a look at that document. One that just came out that I hadn't seen until like 2 days ago was the Office of Child Care and the Office of Head Start fund a technical assistance center, and they have pulled together a more recent document on some efforts that states are doing. I think I'll see if I can find a link to it and maybe get that. I don't know if it'll be too late to add things to the presentation, but it looks like a really great resource too, and I think there were more local examples that you all might be interested in terms of how we begin to address this suspension expulsion issue. The Office of Child Care also issued one of their information memoranda around suspension and expulsion back in 2005, and so there's the link to access that, which if you work with child care is really an important tool. And then you can find some of the data that I presented through the Civil Rights Data Collection. There's a web page and there's some information around that. I was excited to see, I don't know how much you guys track, but there was some conversation around if the Office of Civil Rights was going to continue the data collection, and it looks like they are, and that there won't be many change. It looks like this is going to stay part of it, which we're thrilled about. So, because we feel like we just got started collecting these data, and we need, to see if there are any changes, at least with that small sliver of the early care and education world. So, any other tools or resources, Linda, that you would mention just here in California?
Yeah, if you don't know about Map to Inclusion and Belonging, do you want me to come to the front?
Yeah, here. This will be, then, yeah.
Only because we have all of all of your joint statements are posted on our website in one place.
Great.
Because some of the links stopped working. Okay, sorry. And I forgot my lanyard, so I'm wearing an inappropriate, I'm wearing my teaching pyramid name tag. So if you go to, could we get on the internet on here? We could show people, because I think it's important to know that there are a lot of resources available, and there's a lot of things that you can start doing. So like the BIRs are a great, it's the person who said you have to be fully trained. I think the BIRs help you identify, do you need to have the training? If you're finding that you're collecting lots of incidents, that's a good tell. And you may say, oh gosh, if we have a limited number of people who can attend a training, well, we're going to send these programs or whatever. Because in several communities in the state right now, there are enough trainings going on that people are doing new teacher trainings, or doing, like in Santa Clara, where people can apply and come as a team. So there's ways to do different trainings. Oh, look, you found a teaching pyramid. I'm going to actually go to Map to Inclusion and Belonging, though. So if you go onto if you go to cainclusion.org, you reach this page. Then the teaching pyramid obviously is where you'll find a lot of other things. But if you go to the California Map to Inclusion and Belonging, which is the best kept secret, we like to say in California, there's a ton of resources. So right here under Map Project Resources, down at the bottom it says Reports and Useful Documents. I know, it's a funny title. But over here you can find, we have this California Department of Education, all of their relevant documents. So all the things that they have, we have in one place, and you can download. Then look, the U.S. Ed Policy Statements and Guidance for Early Childhood. So if you click on that, it'll get right away to, the technology, the joint statement on collaboration and coordination. That's the one on the home visiting she was talking about. Then there's the policy statement on careers, on expulsion and suspension, on family engagement, on inclusion of children, etc. So there's just, all of them are here because they're in different places on the federal website, and they move.
Yes.
So
and they will continue to move.
And they will continue to move. And you can find them if you know what you're looking for, but it can be tricky. The other thing I want to point out to people is if you're wondering what's happening in your community, in the county-specific resources under MAP, there's 2 purposes for this. This is meant to be a resource for people who are working in the field and want to know, what are the resources in my community for children with disabilities? We have all that listed. What are the resources for people in my community around early care and education, if you're from the special education side? All those are listed. So let me just show you Santa Clara County since we're here, unless somebody really wants to do another one. So you can click either on the actual map or on the name as you find it over here. So I'm going to click on Santa Clara County. And here it lists, you know, a little bit about Santa Clara County. And then down here it says, here's the county organizations. So the Regional Center, which is our Part C service coordinators, the Early Start Family Resource Centers, so these are funded through some Part C monies, special education local plan areas, the Child Care Research and Referral, local planning councils, County First Fives, County Office of Education, and Early Head Start links. And if any of these are wrong, you email us and let us know. So that's how we try to check them. But then we have another section that's growing called Inclusion and Behavior Resources. So you'll see right here it has Teaching Pyramid, CA CEFL implementation. So if you click on that, or you click, that's, you know, got a plus or a minus, we have some, whoops, I went too far. So we have implementation sites in Deanza. These are sites that have committed to share data with us, and so that we can tell the story. So Deanza Child Development Center is one. And then what we're going to be adding is all of the sites who have been fully trained are going to be listed as implementing agencies and sites, not so that you can bug them, but just so you can see the breadth. So be prepared. You're going to be getting phone calls. So that's what I wanted to show you. I also just want to say, under the resources and links, we have a number of things that are helpful. So there's on social emotional behavior, if you're looking. There's things on coping with trauma, which with the fires and things that can come up. Disability-specific information. These are all not approved, but vetted at least. These are not going to try to take your money for a miracle cure kind of places. These are all either government or organizations that can be trusted. So just, you know, use this website. It's, like I said, it's an incredible resource. And if you feel lost, there is usually up here, hang on here, you can do, I'll see the inclusion conference. But it also, there's a website tour. So you can take this recorded website tour that just lets you know all the things that are on that website, because it is kind of your one-stop shop in California for all things about inclusion, birth to 21. So that's my little advertisement. But it, you know, I do think it's important, in the expulsion bill, while not ideal, is going to provide an opportunity, I think, for us to really get out in front of some of those issues. All the things that she was saying, those of you involved with the teaching pyramid know, we really try to incorporate the policies and procedures and talk about the promotion and prevention aspect earlier. And our favorite thing about families is if the first conversation with a family is, gosh, I'm worried about your child, it's not going to go well. So really talking about those relationships early on. So I'm excited to continue, and we have been doing some things with implicit bias in California in some of the leadership groups. So we'll continue.
Would you mind saying your first and last?
I'm sorry. So I'm Linda Brault, B-R-A-U-L-T, from WestEd, Center for Child and Family Studies, and we're there. You can find us all there. And my contact info, actually, if you go to, I think, About Us, there's a staff information that lists all my staff and pictures, and if you click, it sends emails. So you can find us.
Yeah, and Linda presented yesterday, if you didn't attend, on the California.
And last year I presented on the inclusion statement. I did, and it's recorded. It was virtual, so if you want to see, it was fun because it was hard to do virtually, but we did a whole activities around that inclusion statement because it's the best, and I'm trying to work more and more with locals. So if that's my other hat, is I do inclusion support for the state of California. And so if that's something that you're feeling like you really want to look at after attending this conference and you're all excited, contact us because we're really trying to do more support of local agencies to do, the activities are fabulous. And the questions and the way they're laid out, it really helps you kind of get the right people together in a room and start thinking. So there you go.
Any questions for Linda? You guys have a tremendous resource that you have access to in the state.
Back at you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think, let's see, how are we doing on time? All right. So we have lots of time for questions or ideas, or would love to hear about kind of what's happening in your communities, what you're worried about, what you've tried. I will walk through, let's see, did I lose my, there it is. Whew, did it. I'll end, these are the last few slides I have about the new center. So we, as I mentioned, funded PEP, and PEP will be finishing up this spring and this summer, and they are focused with a lens specifically on equity. But we knew at the Office of Special Ed Programs, kind of the link to inclusion. We often know that our kiddos have trouble being included because of behavioral concerns. We knew that it's going to take a lot more to begin to address the suspension expulsion issue in preschool. We know that in Part C, for those of you that work in the Part C early intervention world, many of the states are focused on improving their social emotional outcomes for infants and toddlers with disabilities, and so we felt like we needed to make an investment to help support those states some more. And the family engagement piece, that we really felt like we wanted to have a stronger focus on that. So when we decided to think about our technical assistance investments for this year, we decided we wanted to fund a TA center focused on social emotional development. And so this is kind of similar. Years ago, HHS, Office of Head Start and Child Care Bureau at that time funded CEFL, if you're familiar with CEFL, and then a year later we funded the Taxi Project. I know all these, more terms, but it's basically those two projects ended up developing the pyramid model, which the last several years has not had any federal funding, and I think the fact that it exists in so many states speaks to how powerful the pyramid model really has been, both to local programs and to states on addressing this issue. So we wanted to fund a center for 5 years. It's funded at $1.1 million, which isn't a whole lot of money. We think in early childhood, a lot of our centers are funded at lower levels than the K-12 ones. And we think that our centers are really terrific at doing a lot with very little. But what I wanted to highlight, so we asked them to really focus on strengthening or developing a multi-tiered system of support framework that will improve social, emotional, and behavioral development, and that does all of these things. This is kind of like the kitchen sink, and we see who's brave enough to join us on developing the kitchen sink, but really focus on evidence-based practices, meeting the needs of infants and toddlers as well as preschoolers, reducing inappropriate and disproportionate discipline practices affecting young children of color. So we feel like the work from PEP will feed right into this, and they can continue to develop that work and potentially work with more model sites and at the state level. And then the next one, kind of specific to this conference, increasing the inclusion and ongoing participation of young children with disabilities in early childhood setting, promoting family engagement, and then is relevant for the wide variety of early childhood settings that we know exist in the real world. So here's some more of our muckety-muck language about what we want them to do. But, one of the brilliant things I think about the pyramid model is not only did they develop this framework, but they also are so thoughtful about implementation and what it means and how those implementation drivers and supports are just as important as the interventions. And those are things like the leadership team, like strong coaching models, really engaging and getting buy-in across your entire staff. So those things are just as important. So they're going to continue to work on those pieces as well as, and I mentioned and highlighted here, the data piece. So here are the folks. It is very similar to who is on PEP, but we're super excited. They actually get started next month, November 1st, and have laid out some really exciting, innovative strategies for moving forward. So stay tuned. There's going to be a lot more coming from them, and hopefully the work they do will filter to organizations like Linda's, so that the tools can be used and appropriate for different states. So with that, that's all I had in the formal presentation. Any questions, comments? I would love, I'm headed back to DC, to the crazy world of DC. Would love to hear, real stories about what you're struggling with, any successes, things I can take back. The use of resources like this, how helpful is it that the federal government put these out? Yeah, that was one question I had, Linda. Do you track how many downloads you get on any of these?
Actually, we do. I'll have to see if we have individuals. We do have we track a lot of the downloads by page. I'll be happy to share.
That would be great.
Yeah.
That would be great. Well, great. Well, if there's nothing else, thank you all so much for sticking with me. And
Thank you, Jennifer. Safe travels. And also just a reminder, online, your evaluation, those virtually participating as well as those in the room, please give us your feedback. We're very interested in that. So thank you very much, Jennifer.
you're welcome.
Thank you all.